on 1 o'clock. We've got quite a lot to get through, so I think we're going to just plough straight on, let people join us as they come in. So everybody who's managed to join us already, thank you very much. Nice to see so many people on board again. This is the final of our series of 3 Carbon Charter webinars to replace our regular garden party, sort of focused broadly around these issues of what is a sustainable recovery from lockdown and how does that look like. So I'm very pleased that we're going to have some more interesting discussion around that today. I'm going to pass over very shortly. I just wanted to say that for people who've missed the first 2 or want to catch up on this one, we're making the recordings available on carboncharter.org, along with any questions that we haven't got around to answering during the session. If you do have questions today, if you can post them in the chat function, which you'll find in the menu at the bottom. And I think that's all I need to say, really. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to our regular host, Nick WOOLLEY, to introduce today's keynote speaker.
Well, thank you, Ned, and thank you to your marvelous team for all you've done in bringing this webinar series to life. And a very good afternoon and warm welcome again from the WOOLLEY team. We started off in the first of our webinar series on the global scale, talking of the World Economic Forum's strategy for the future entitled The Great Reset, backed by the UN, the IMF, and very many others. That day, Neville Ash, UN Environment Director, emphasized the need to place the environment at the heart of our response to the COVID situation. Last week, Joey Tabone considered how we could all work with Suffolk County Council to address all manner of life issues to reach zero carbon by 2030, as Suffolk has vowed to do. Today, we're fortunate to hear from a remarkable civil engineer and master planner, David Taylor. David and I first worked together nearly 30 years ago, and he'll talk on the need to create real places for people where they can thrive and live healthy and happier lives. This, of course, lies at the heart of the WOOLLEY ethos. Hence, we very happily have worked together for a very long time. He will talk on the real needs of Homo sapiens, just one species in nature, which has finally recognized that without a healthy natural world, its future is dangerously at risk. COVID has brought us back to a reality check. And as the Great Reset states, we have to change our ways if we want that future for ourselves and our children. In the early 1990s, under Master Architect Leon Krier, David laid out the first phase of Prince Charles's remarkable extension to Dorchester Poundbury. Since then, David has worked in many places around the world as well as with us. He is now master planning some huge and very special places in the UK for our better future. So, David, tell us where we come from and how we can create real places for people. Thank you.
Well, many thanks, Nick. That's excellent. When you asked me to conclude this series of 3 webinars that you just described to us, I did think long and hard about how I could bring together in 15 minutes or so, a bit of a thought for the day, some of the thoughts that relate to some of the major issues of sustainability that you've been talking about in the previous events. And I'll just share my screen now. I've got about a dozen slides. I'll show some of those quite quickly. I'll hover on others. And the first one you'll see is a blue one, so don't get worried. Nothing's gone wrong, I hope, but we will see. Okay, so when I started thinking about all of that, Nick, I actually became rather sad because we're not meeting at your lovely office and house in Freckenham at what is always the most marvellous annual event. So to take us there for a moment, I thought it would be good to show this slide from another time at the end of last year, maybe a slightly happier time. And I'm sure if we'd have been with you at Freckenham, we would have all sensed and experienced your passion for sustainability and everything electric, including the car. And for those wondering about the small one, it's also a chance to let you know of Nick's generous gift of a not quite so big Tesla to me for a charity called the Maypole Project, which I'm deeply involved with. So many thanks for that, Nick. But just to take us there for a minute, but to take us somewhere else as well, from Freckenham to a different view and the subject in hand. The task you've asked me to tackle is actually quite challenging. How can we relate the macro issues of world sustainability to our everyday lives in planning and thinking about the towns and cities we live in? We're living on an ever-changing planet. It's changing at an ever-alarming rate. And as you said, it's a world that's now having to adapt to this crazy pandemic. So for me, we're at a time of great change. And maybe one of the biggest changes has been how we all virtually communicate now. Here we all are. We're all in different rooms around the country, meeting in a new virtual way. Now, who would have thought of that 6 months ago? But constant change in the way we relate to one another and to the world is also one of the biggest risks I think we face. So now is a time that really needs some good reflection, care and thought. It's not a time for rash political decisions to solve the problems of now. It's a time for us to think about our world and the word you used, Nick, our place within it. A time to think about the places we live in and the challenges that are happening all around us. And clearly there are many. So for this 15-minute session, I thought I would take change and place as the theme to bring forward some ideas that are certainly live in my mind at the moment, and I hope will be of interest to all. So the first one, technology. I've just mentioned it. Is it the fourth revolution? If we dive into the web now, we can see an emerging view of how technology is perceived as critical to everything. There's no doubt that technology is changing our lives and has been a lifeline through this crisis. But is it a key for the future? Now here, the World Economic Forum is debating technology as a critical infrastructure. The fourth industrial revolution. Schooling is changing. Society is responding in different ways. We are relating to each other differently. So the natural conclusion of that question is that technology will change the way we govern ourselves, the way we live, and it will change the way we shape the places we live in. But technology itself is also changing quickly. And in the UK, we're exploring infrastructure systems in what is constantly referred to as the new normal. How weird, the new normal. Something I can't quite get my head around. Is it normal? I hope not. We're missing so much. We have seen so many changes over the past few months. Technology has allowed us working from home, shopping online, and much more. But it also raises as many questions as it answers. Working from home, fine for some, but in a small flat with children. Are large offices viable now? How could that change affect our towns and cities? Is there a desire for employees to return to the office to bring back the social interaction needed in our lives? Here at the Institution of Civil Engineers, there's a very strong and robust debate going on about how we as a country need to respond, adapt and change. A technological and economic response to a major problem, but there is little mention of place. Technology is becoming dominant. The change of now is dominant. A sense of place is becoming subservient. But the counter to that for me is that over the past few months, while our lives have changed so universally, I sense we've all found a stronger connection to the places we live in. A sense of place that we feel when we're there, but we find it so hard to quantify. There has been time to appreciate place, listen and see things we may have previously missed. Our air is cleaner, towns have been quieter, and nature has quietly taken a stronger role. Now, of course, we've all got our own place. We relate to places in different ways. This is mine, Greenwich in London. And over the past few months, I've walked down streets free of cars. I've heard new sounds and appreciated the park and views in very, very different ways. So my argument is that while changes like technology are easily recognised and quantified, the sense of your place, like Greenwich Park or the street you live in, is not. We have a challenge: how to balance changes like technology with a sense of place, culture, and nature itself. So, how can we make that balance between the fast changes in our lives and the way we live with the slow unalterability of nature and place? Now, for me, Stuart Brand's place layering diagram has always given a really strong clue. If you take a cross-section of a healthy civilization, where the circular layers represent parts of society that move at different rates, the most rapidly changing parts are at the top, such as fashion, our everyday clothes, decoration, and all of that. The slowest parts are at the bottom, such as nature, our culture. Brand then sets out layers between fashion and nature: commerce, infrastructure, the physical and social layers of our town, governance, and there's enough said of that, and then culture above nature. And the argument he puts forward is that we have a solid and sustainable equilibrium if all the layers rotate with one another. Fashion can change rapidly on the outer edge, but nature has to go much slower. It will go slower on the centre. And the problem arises, Brand calls it turbulence. Turbulence occurs when lower layers move faster than the upper ones. This is then unsustainable. And I think the problem we need to recognise is that over the past 80 years, we have been planning the physical and social infrastructure of our towns and cities by making short-term, fashionable decisions. Fashion and infrastructure have swapped place. Please hold that thought. My feeling is our planning is in turbulence. Now, it was 80 years ago that the British planner Thomas Sharp gave this warning, which we're still really in need to heed today. 80 years where we have been responding to the fashion of a particular time. Fashionable planning. 50s, post-war restructuring. 60s, the tower block. 70s, planning for the car, the cul-de-sac. 80s, out-of-town shopping. The list goes on. And bottom right on the screen here is Andreas Dwaney's well-used diagram that, for me, explains this so well. We've been building the top half, zone sprawl. Each fashion that comes along turns into another zone on that diagram. Housing estates, retail parks, not integrated, not sustainable like traditional towns. So if a change like technology influences infrastructure and governance in the uncontrolled way we have seen in the past, we've got a big problem as we leave COVID. And the result will be just more unsustainable planning. And for me, the risk in 2020 is that we see a new fashion, technological planning, What will our towns look like with that? So let's think about some of the examples of what I've called fashionable planning. I've got 3 here, but clearly there are many. First, retail planning, a classic example of recent turbulence. For 40 years, we've been structuring our towns on the premise of the outermost ring of Brand's diagram, fashionable, retail-led business parks or malls. We now hear of companies like Into and many others, the UK's largest, starting to fall into receivership. Clearly, that's a complex issue, but probably because of more fashionable online shopping, topped off by recent events. So rather than thinking about people and place, we have and continue to waste money, energy, and our natural resources on what are only fashionable short-term responses, rather than place-led towns for people. The infrastructure of our towns has been built on the premise of one objective, an objective that could be completely irrelevant in 20 years' time. What will our retail parks look like in 20 years' time? And in our cities, we've got places, this is not far from me, this is Lewisham Gateway. These are becoming the norm in the centre of cities. We know nothing from the 60s. Here we've got new multi-storey blocks, minimum space standards. These are all founded on the principle of mass transit, public transport to office blocks in the city. Those blocks where we're actually questioning if people might work. Are these really the places of the future? And recently, our planning system has been full of what seems to be no more than fashionable rhetoric. Fashionable words like garden towns. Fine if the sustainable economic and design principles of the original garden towns were followed through in full, but absolute disasters if not. I really believe we need to recognise this now. But enough of the bad. What should our response be? Well, Nick mentioned that I was involved with Lee and Creer in Poundbury in the 90s. So I'm just going to relate to that and a couple of other projects, which might give some clues as to what the future is. But firstly, I think we need to recognise the issues in Brand's diagram. And by thinking like that, we can question every decision we make. We need to make decisions against its place in Brand's layers. Secondly, I think we also need to recognise that the principles of traditional neighbourhoods and mixed-use urbanism that are at the core of Lee and Creer's plan for Poundbury and many other places give a great skeleton for planning the towns of our future. And thirdly, recognising that for the past 40 years, there have also been many good stories too. Exemplar places like Poundbury or others, there's Upton in Northamptonshire, there are many more. They all may not be 100% perfect in everyone's mind, but I believe there's much to learn from them. Here at Poundbury, if you skip the argument about architecture, you'll see a 21st century place in the making. It's a place for people, a place that has rethought the position of infrastructure, economics and design. It's a place with people's needs at its core, and it's got a resilience that can respond to change, to any change that's thrown at it. And I believe that when you consider a place like this against Brand's layers, it has a timeless urbanism with a strength that responds to the changes I've been talking about. So a change like technology, as we leave COVID and other changes, can be part of this place. They can be part of it, but they shouldn't dictate what it is physically like. I mentioned Upton just now. This is in Northamptonshire, an urban extension to Northampton. Here, the plan was cast around walkable distances to a primary school and local centres. There's been a great exploration of building types, their long-term adaptability. Some houses have ceiling heights that are generous to allow changes to other uses. They've got different responses to energy consumption. Sustainable urban drainage, landscapes and play spaces are part of the street design, not secondary add-ons, which we often see. And also in other places like Alconbury and Northstowe, we've seen a rethinking of development economics. Schools built before houses, so community can start from day one. Great ingredients in many places, but all too often we seem to lack the ability to bring them all together, to bake the great cake. And I'm going to conclude with a wrap-up of the current project that Nick mentioned at the start of these few minutes. And it's a project in Tempsford, in Bedfordshire, where we've been exploring how to use the ingredients, the sort of ingredients that I've just been touching on, to plan a new town of around 12,000 homes. This town is going to be on the crossing point of the new East-West Railway and the East Coast Main Line, just north of Sandy. And the plan we've been working on is structured around traditional neighbourhoods like the ones shown in Andreas Duane's diagram, streets and squares, and hopefully it will have a great sense of place. I do hope it will have the resilience to adapt and change over time. This is something we're considering at the heart of the plan at the moment. And things like the technology I started this core at are part of the town. Smart city. But they're not going to dictate its form. Its form will be traditional neighbourhoods, walkable, sustainable urbanism. Well, I think I've used my 15 minutes up now. As I said earlier, I think it's no more than a slightly longer version of Thought for the Day. But I hope I've brought some ideas to what's a very wide and complex issue at the moment in the country. But as we start to emerge again, it does seem to be a great time of opportunity. But maybe in rising to that opportunity, let's not lose what makes our towns and cities special, that sense of place. And I'm going to leave it there, okay?
David, thank you very much indeed. I would call that several thoughts for the day, probably included in that, but a lot of useful topics, and I think it feeds on very nicely from some of the topics we've had already. It's also nice to change our focus, that we've looked at stages at the kind of global and then at the very specific kind of business level, but to think about that community town level, I think is, well, it's certainly very relevant to the work we're doing at the council anyway. We do have a number of questions, if that's okay. I'm going to put you on the spot with some of these. We've also got a number of questions here coming in about electric vehicles, which I think is people who are already looking ahead to the next part of this session. So I'm just going to hold on to those and we'll come back to them later on. We should have time for all of them. But so there is a question that's come in that I think is sort of relevant to the topic we've had around looking at these issues in the middle of the coronavirus and so on, is that how do we take these decisions about town planning? Effectively, we're dealing with two crises at the same time. And one of them hopefully is temporary and one of them is perhaps longer term, but does that cloud the way in which we do town planning if things like social distancing mean that people don't use shops so much, perhaps, is one way that we're going. Does that need to be factored into the decisions now, I guess, is the question.
Well, it's looking to the future, but my thought is actually not. And the reason I'm saying that is that I'm sure if we'd have been having this discussion in 1946, we'd have been looking at a response to, a catastrophe of its time. And probably if we'd have been having this discussion in the 70s, we'd be having a response to building tower blocks in the 60s. So Now, clearly, the COVID pandemic is a major issue, and there's no way I'm trying to belittle that, and it's something we have to take very seriously. But our towns are actually timeless, or they should be timeless. We should be building towns that could be here in 500 or 1,000 years. Part of the problem we've had over the past 50, 60 years has been we've been building things for the short term. I had a commission once, I won't tell you who it was from, but it was to plan and build a distribution centre. And I was told it was not allowed to stand up after 40 years. And the reason for that was the economic case lasted 40 years. After 40 years, it was going to be demolished. It's crazy. So clearly we have to think about social distancing. You know, we can think about temporary measures and actually how we respond. But for me, we should keep the longer term vision of what our towns should be like in 10, 20, 30, 40 years' time, because those are the towns that we are actually thinking about now and will be building now. And the more infrastructure we build now, the harder it will be to change those towns in the future.
Yeah, thank you. I think thinking long term is perhaps a challenge we need to get to grips with in all sorts of areas. There's a couple of other questions that just come in. So one from somebody who is anonymous here, but interesting question, asking about the ways in which the inevitable technical innovation, and you did touch on this in your talk a bit, but I guess specific ways in which the inevitable technical innovation will make town planning more sustainable.
Mm. Well, I think I mean, my starting point is, you know, it's hopefully come across in that talk is very much that towns should be built on the principles of mixed-use urbanism, the sort of towns that we relate to, the centre of our historic towns, great places, absolutely fantastic. Those towns can adapt to technology equally well as something that's from Silicon Valley. So the example that I mentioned in Bedfordshire was a town that is built on traditional values, but actually right at its core, technology is built in. So technology then, we can start to see clearly about changes in movement. You know, you mentioned electric cars earlier. We're probably, I don't know how quickly it'll be, we'll come to driverless cars. We'll certainly come to driverless public transport systems. So we need to have a plan that can relate to the principles of the past, but actually look to the future. So when we're building in a tolerance to allow those changes to come. And for me, some of the technology that we're seeing now is clearly incredibly innovative. But my suspicion is in 10 or 20 years' time, it will be even more innovative. And I think that's the biggest challenge we have. You know, what will the changes that are needed in our town be? Incredibly hard to predict.
Thank you. If we've got time for a couple more questions, I think there's two or three actually that kind of follow on from that quite nicely and all link into each other. So, I mean, Nick was raising that point about planning for things like electric and driverless vehicles and also battery storage and solar and all the rest of it. But I think if I can just merge that with a couple of other questions. So Samantha's asked about sustainable materials and things like all new homes to be built with solar panels. And then there's another question raising this sort of thorny issue of design versus retrofit and saying actually is too much focus on retrofit and really this is a design problem. I guess it's probably that we need to do both, but certainly there's a challenge there if we're building things at the moment that we know are going to have to be retrofitted in 10 or 20 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, on building materials, you know, I mean, I mean, it's a huge challenge, isn't it? It's very easy to be flip about these things, but locally sourced building materials actually add to the character of place as much as being sustainable. You know, go to a town in Northamptonshire and you'll recognise it through Northamptonshire, you know, through stone. Go to the East End of London and recognise the London stock, you know, materials that are actually produced locally that actually can come into those buildings. So the sort of principles I've been talking about here, and if you can remember the slide I showed on Upton, and talking about sustainability in solar panels, it's very, very easy now to incorporate this technology in housing. That technology shouldn't actually influence the planning of a place. It's something that we can just do, and we can do it now, and it just should be everywhere. In terms of retrofit, clearly we've got retrofit of existing buildings, and we've also got potential for retrofit in the future. Clearly there's a major benefit in retrofit of existing buildings. Our existing building stock are our towns and cities. But we're starting to see some rather odd planning guidance coming out about things like the high street. Maybe shops can turn into flats. You know, we've seen some really poor examples of retrofit of previous office blocks with minimum space standards. You know, clearly very bad. But looking to the future, some little things that were done on Upton, and I know are being done elsewhere, is things like lifetime homes, but also having story heights, built residential story heights that are slightly greater than the norm. So you've got the potential for changing a house maybe into a commercial unit. You can then put maybe some different mechanical ventilation in, or you can change it more easily. And also things like, I mean, the point I talked about with working at home. There's a simple trick that was done in Poundbury, and you could see it as a retrofit. It's actually a forward-looking trick, which was on most of the garages that are in car parking courts. There's a small room that's been built above the garage that can be used as a small workshop or as an office. So having a house that's actually got more space than you would need at the moment and making it more adaptable clearly has got to be something we've got to think about in the future. You know, the number of stories we're hearing now about people working at home and wanting to go to bed, go back to work because they're working on the end of their bed, you know, that they don't actually have space for a desk in their flat. This is crazy, absolutely crazy. So these are the things we've really got to seriously think about now, you know, as we look to the future.
I'm going to try and squeeze in just two more quick questions if we can, just because there's a lot here to deal with, but I think there's some good points come up. So John Matheson has raised this point about, there's a lot about new towns, but really perhaps that's not the issue for Suffolk. And you've talked about the potential for sustainable town planning, but whatever happens with new towns, and we're going to have an awful lot of towns that are already here. So how do we deal with those?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I suppose the first question there is what are the demands on those towns, those existing towns? You know, is it housing? Is it economy? Is it the economy? But I think on that, if you dive into the web and look, how can I put it? Sorry, I'm losing my track of thought now. But the essence for me in towns, say smaller towns in places like Suffolk, is actually understanding their DNA before you do anything. So the historic of the DNA is bedded in the infrastructure of the town. You know, it's probably in the high street, secondary streets that come from the high street. And by actually understanding the DNA, you can start to think about what is the most appropriate place to actually grow a town. You know, very often I'm seeing the most appropriate place to change and grow is probably the waste bit of land or the brownfield land on the side. Well, it might not be in the right place. It might be better to grow a town more organically in a slightly more beautiful area. So I think those are some of the challenges there. I'll leave it there. I think it's a big issue, that I know, but for me, start with the DNA of the place and then grow from that.
And I'm going to throw one more at you, and I'll just ask for a very quick question on this if we can. But from Ruby Shepson's asked about, you touched on timeless, tolerant and resilient communities, and wanted a bit more detail, particularly about, in terms of resilience, looking beyond SUD's kind of drainage setups. What do you think are the most important elements of resilience for future sustainable places?
Well, for me, and I suppose this is coming from my starting point as an engineer, is the resilience of the street system and the movement network in a town. Movement, and this is one of the challenges that's hit us in the COVID crisis. We can't move around. You know, I think we've all realised the luxury we have in actually being able to move freely in our towns. So for me, the key resilience is actually is how we move through our towns, that we've got choices in the way we move, but also that great colleague of mine would put this in a much better way than me, Paul Moraine, but he would say something like minimum distance for maximum interaction. Move the minimum amount for the maximum interaction. Social interaction, economic interaction, etc., etc.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. It's really useful. We could go through it a lot more, but we do have more to cover and want to try and finish more or less on time. I think we'll probably overrun again for people who want to stay and hang around to have extra questions. But other than that, I'm delighted that we've got our very own EV expert, Peter Frost, here, because we've touched on it already, but electric vehicles and transport generally is such a big part of the kind of net zero challenge that I think it's a topic of interest to many people. So Peter, if you want to take over.
Yes, hi, thank you everyone. It's good to be here, and thank you for everyone sticking with us through this series of 3 webinars. It's been a really excellent experience. I'm going to dive straight into my presentation, which is trying to give a flavour, there we go, and just trying to give you a flavour of when you physically go to the beautiful countryside of Freckenham, and what normally happens is we have the speeches, we have the nice food and the chats and everything, and as people are leaving, we have a little bit more time just to look around the electric cars that have been on display for the last few years, and it's been a really nice way to end the overall proceedings of the day. So I'm trying to recreate that here by having this. It's quite apt that we have electric cars as the last presentation of the series, and also to reproduce it when we have the garden event. We're very much at the mercy of the weather, so I put raindrops across some of the slides, so you see those, that's why they're there. And so yep, I'm Environment Strategy Officer for Suffolk County Council, and the electric vehicle advocate, normally everyone's go-to guy when they have questions about these. So the reason for this speech, the real sort of theme to it, is that things are moving a lot quicker than people realise. The introduction of electric vehicles, I was in at the beginning of it, and it was quite a slow process to start with, but now it's really gaining momentum in an exponential way, and people are much more positive towards the concept of electric vehicles, which is tremendous to be part of. And it's not actually just electric vehicles. Sorry, it's not just electric cars. There's other vehicles that are being electrified as well. Stena Line have their Jutlandica hybrid ferry, which doesn't emit any pollution when it's in port. JCB are working on electric diggers that can work all 8-hour shifts on one charge. Obviously, Tesla, among other companies that are bringing in heavy goods vehicles. John Deere tractors are doing a tremendous amount of research to bring in electric powered farm equipment, not just a direct replacement like the green one you can see there on the slide, but also the one below that, the red one, as mentioned earlier, the incoming of autonomous vehicles. So they're actually developing tractors that don't even have a place for the farmer to sit on. The tractors will actually be doing the job for them. And they'll go back to base and recharge themselves as and when they need to. And also, a lot of people don't realize aircraft is one of the toughest nuts to crack, but it's already happening. Over in Canada, Harbour Air is a company that have now started a regular electric-powered seaplane service across the area of Vancouver there. So that's actually happening, which a lot of people are surprised at. But what we'd normally do at the Freckenham would be, we'd have a lot of electric vehicles that would be great fun to have a look round, have a chat to people about. And there are so many cars now to consider that aren't too expensive. They're now coming right down into the reach of more and more people. So the ones I would have liked to have had at Freckenham, if we were having the physical event, it would have been great to have one of the early Volkswagen ID3s there. We were quite confident we'd have got the Vauxhall Corsa E or the Peugeot E208, small hatchbacks that are very reasonably priced. And also all of those do over 200. They do somewhere between 200 and 300 miles in range. Slightly less than that is the Skoda Citigo, 160 miles range, but still a very viable second car in the family and much more affordable. And I know our hosts would be very much advocating the MG ZS electric, because they actually have one of those and they've been really, really impressed at how well that's suited them as a vehicle. And the reason I put that battery in the bottom right-hand corner, rather than the picture of the Renault Zoe, which is a car I'm very familiar with, when the Renault Zoe was launched back in 2012, 2013 in the UK, the battery did about 80 miles. You could look at about 80 miles range, which was a little bit restrictive. The Zoe I actually own myself at the moment, that does about 160 to 200 miles. If you go out and buy a new Zoe, that's now looking at 240 to 250 miles. Now, the interesting thing is the battery in the car is exactly the same size. So it's actually become 3 times longer range, but the same size battery. So it's just a clear indication of how that technology is improving. And there are now, especially when you take into account the lower running costs, there are now viable cars for just about everybody who might be in the market for one. But we're obviously also, we talk to businesses as well, and there are many vans to consider. Peugeot Citroën have launched their van with a 75 kilowatt hour battery. That gives it a much more practical range. I've actually, it's interesting, I've got a quote from British Gas here, but which normally costs us hundreds of pounds, but no, this is a different sort of quote from British Gas. This is the managing director of British Gas, who's quoted to say how committed to the transition to electric vehicles they are. And they really are committed to it, because they have put in an order for 1,000 electric vans. That's the Vauxhall Vivaro electric van that he's standing beside. Again, with a range between 1 and 200 miles. And that's not a pilot project. That's not dipping your toe in the water. That is a real commitment to change. And so we're seeing more and more businesses are switching over and seeing the benefits of going electric with their vans, commercial vehicles, and their passenger vehicles. Ourselves at Suffolk County Council, the bottom right-hand corner picture there is all of us standing beside the floods team van, which they're now using. And the nice thing is they're tremendous advocates for electric vehicles now. They're saying how good they are and spreading the word on them. So they are coming in and they are much more usable. There's much more choice in the market. If I can give you a business case example, just briefly, our friends, Carbon Charter members at Yum Yum Tree Fudge, based at Woolpit, which is about halfway between Stowmarket and Bury St Edmunds, tremendous friends of the Carbon Charter, and they also, I hasten to add, make absolutely phenomenally good fudge. They are a fantastic company, and they started off changing one of their vans. They've now changed both of their vans. Their delivery vans are now both electric, and they're reaping the benefits of the lower running costs and the better publicity that comes along with that. And it builds its own momentum, because they're now also installing solar panels, extra solar panels on their factory unit, and they're also installing batteries as well. And they estimate that they're going to be able to drive about 15,000 miles a year just on their solar power, which is tremendously good. So that's what's happening with them. And thank you very much for them letting me use them as an example. And also the number of chargers around East Anglia now are growing tremendously. I don't know if people have noticed, but more petrol stations are actually closing as well. So the whole situation is switching over. But it's now a situation that you should be able to find somewhere to charge when you're out on a longer journey. It's more a question of when I get somewhere to charge, what's actually going to be my experience with it, which is something else we're working on. It's actually easier once you have an electric vehicle for any length of time and gain the experience, then it's much easier than you first think. But we are actually trying to do something about that as well. Suffolk County Council has launched the Plug-in Suffolk project, which not only is accelerating the rollout of charge points at various publicly accessible places around the county, but it's also the key point about it is its accessibility. You don't have to belong to an exclusive club. You don't have to carry around a specific RFID card or have an app on your phone. You literally roll up to the charge point, plug your car in and just pay using a contactless credit card, which is probably how the whole industry is going to move in the longer term. So that's Plug-in Suffolk. And also we're part of the B Anglia project, the Business Energy Efficiency project, reducing the carbon footprints of small or medium enterprises across both Norfolk and Suffolk. And we're now able to offer 40% grants. So any SME that's looking to reduce their carbon footprint, and they may be thinking of changing a diesel van to an electric van, we can actually help them out towards that with a grant. They've been so inundated with inquiries during this period that they're trying to catch up with all of the inquiries that they've been having. But that's something to bear in mind. Do look for more details on beanglia.org if you get a chance. And it's interesting, there are big changes coming to society that are going to surprise people for the environment. One that springs to mind that I thought would be sacrosanct was nothing to do with cars for now, but just to mention that Johnny Walker whiskey, always been in glass, they're now looking at a plastic-free, paper-based bottle for their black label whiskey, which is such a culture shock for people who are traditionally focused on glass bottles. It may come a point in the future where people say, "What, you used to put drinks in glass? That was very heavy on the environment. You know, what were you thinking of? Why didn't you use paper-based bottles earlier?" And I think the situation is the same. I mean, they mentioned there that the new bottle technology is going to be groundbreaking, but obviously, hopefully, if you drop it on the ground, it doesn't break. That would be a major advantage over glass. And but there's also changes, seismic changes coming as far as cars are concerned. So when a few years back it was 2040 where the sale of internal combustion engine vehicles was going to come to an end. That's now been brought to 2035. There's now calls to bring it to 2032 or maybe even 2030. So that date keeps coming forwards. And so that's a clear indication of how quickly things are changing, faster than people first thought. And I know it's only one bank in the Netherlands at the moment, but because of fossil fuel car lease programs running the risk of being the second-hand price at the end of the lease is going to be very low. There's a bank in the Netherlands that have actually stopped doing bank loans towards fossil fuel cars. They're only doing them for electric vehicles because they're seeing the way the future is going. So seismic shifts are coming, and who knows, the technology's changing so quickly, as has already been mentioned, and who knows what we may be seeing at future events so far as car technology goes. There's been some good exclusives at our events, including the hydrogen-powered Nexo car that's on there, and also one of the very first Tesla Model 3 performances, which I was fortunate enough to get a ride in at the last event we had at Freckenham. So that's the way things are going, and hopefully that's been an interesting talk, and I thank you very much for listening.
That's great. Thank you very much, Peter. I'm conscious that we are going to slightly overrun. If that's okay, I would like to, because I know that people have questions, and I would like to go through those. Obviously, if people need to leave, well, that's your choice, of course. But we will make the recording available for people who want to come back to that later on. Conscious that people may be leaving, just before we move to the questions, and while people are still here, I do just have to say thank you to everyone who's made this possible, in particular to our speakers, so David today and Peter, and to Joey, to Bone and Neville Ash, and indeed Councillor Richard Rout, for giving up their time to prompt these conversations. And also, of course, big thanks to Nick and Liz and the team at WOOLLEY for both nudging us into doing this and contributing to the development of it, and indeed to their wider families for their contributions to parts of this, and Amy and the team at Groundwork as well, and also to Peter again, of course, as well as being an EV expert, has also kept the whole thing ticking along. So thank you everybody for all of that, and to everybody who's been able to join us. We have a number of questions I'm just going to throw at you, Peter, if that's okay. Starting with one from Adrian Turner that I think actually in some ways ties back to the last one around town planning and things as well, but looking at the change with more online orders and deliveries and so on, and particularly Royal Mail, where often their vans perhaps don't drive very great distances, they've got a local route. How do we go about encouraging organisations like that to switch to electric?
That's quite interesting you mentioned the Royal Mail, because the Royal Mail are actually trialling converted the London Electric Vehicle Company make the taxis that are now available that tend to be in London, the cabs, and they've actually managed to adapt those to be parcel delivery vans, and they're actually practicing with those. So I think they'll find that they're so good on the lower running costs and the more convenience, and also quieter as well. If you're driving in and out of neighbourhoods, it's nice not to have a rattly diesel van outside your house. But they are already trialling those, so they're looking to those. It makes so much sense in any environment where you're only doing, say, less than 100 miles and it's mostly stop-start driving. It makes so much sense to have an electric vehicle. There's so many benefits involved. And so I think it'll be an exponential snowball effect. The more companies that do it, the more companies will begin to see it happening and take it up.
I think often the familiarity with the technology is a new thing. I'm going to put some quick fire questions to you, asking for quick fire answers if you can. Are charging connections likely to settle down to one market leader?
Yes, the nice thing is the reason with the plug-in Suffolk project is we actually went for what's called the Type 2 connector, which is it's not the fastest charging system, but it is universal across all cars, and also most people who have an electric car have the same connector at their house. So the Type 2 connector, I think, is going to be ubiquitous for all vehicles into the future, even as the other standards tend to change. There's CCS and CHAdeMO, which were at first looked upon like the Betamax versus VHS argument about home video recording, but they're actually able to work they're able to coexist together. So most rapid chargers have actually got both on them, so you can use those. But even cars, when they eventually start pulling over charging points where they inductively charge, so they don't actually have a rapid charger built in at all, even those are still going to have the Type 2 connector sockets on them, because there's just going to be the legacy of so many charge points with that particular connector. So yes, I think that for fast charging, it's going to be Type 2 away into the future. The more rapid charging, I think will stay with CCS and CHAdeMO, and eventually evolve on into the inductive charging as well.
I'm going to try and get through 2 or 3 more questions in the next few minutes, and then we will try and address any others that we don't get to today. So Jane Herbert has asked about what about EVs for people living in flats?
Yes, this comes up quite a bit. About 40% of households don't have off-road parking, so they can't necessarily charge it. But the good thing is that that was a really big issue back when the range of an electric car was, say, 80 miles. That's very restrictive, and you really need to be charging that, you know, if not every night, at least every other night, even if you're not doing too many miles. But the situation now, where a lot of the cars are doing between 200 and 300 miles, that's a week, if not a fortnight's commuting for a lot of people. So it's not such an issue. And I think people who can't charge overnight, in fact, what they will end up doing is simply tying in the charging of their vehicle to their daily routine. So if they can't charge at home, they'll charge at work, or they'll charge at the shops, or they'll charge somewhere where they are anyway. So, or they'll go to a rapid charging station once a week and just top up. That's most likely scenario that's going to happen with that.
And there's a couple of questions here from John Matheson, who's asked about a challenging question for you. Why has our rural county still got such a low provision of public EV charging?
Yes, I mean, I often direct people to, there's a British website, but it's zapmap.com, which has a map of the charging infrastructure throughout the country. And it does look, when you look at it, there are certain parts of the country that have a tremendous lack of charging infrastructure, which is obviously what we're trying to address with projects like Plug-in Suffolk. We're trying to accelerate that additional charging infrastructure to reassure people, if they want to make the step to electric cars, they will be able to find a charge point at some point, and also encourage people to come in as tourists as well. If someone has an electric vehicle, they're not going to come somewhere where they're pretty nervous about not being able to charge. So it has benefits all the way around. So yes, we are trying to accelerate that tremendously, but and it is working. As people are switching up into it, it is getting faster.
He's also made the point, which favour two-car family is a phrase. We need more no-car families, and I think it is worth mentioning that yeah, it's not only about shifting to electric. We also need modal shift as well. But clearly, particularly in Suffolk, there's still going to be high demand for cars and vehicles generally. I
think as autonomous vehicles come out as well, you're going to find a lot of people are going to discover that Tony Sieber did a very interesting report called The Clean Disruption, it was called, and where he looked at the average household, if they gave up their car and just used, and I know you have to pay for the journeys, but you used autonomous taxi services instead. They reckon that was like a £3,000 a year that they'd save. So people are going to do the maths and realize that they don't need a car sitting outside their house all the time. No, the reason I mentioned two-car families is a lot of two-car families, it's low-hanging fruit. You could very easily have the second car in your family. It's a bit of a no-brainer to have it as an electric car.
And then I think we might just have to take one more. So Charles Croydon has asked about, can we publish a list of installers or electricians on Plug-in Suffolk who can install charging devices? Plug-in Suffolk only lists EO. I don't think we have that list at the County Council. I think, I mean, I think it is, you know, if it's something that's useful, perhaps what we need to look at. So the County Council runs a trusted trader scheme, and I was thinking about this, and I wonder if maybe an issue there is that the categories are a bit outdated. That perhaps doesn't consider things like electric vehicles and some of the newer sustainable technologies. So perhaps that's something we could take away to look at. That, you know, if we have companies that are registered with that scheme already that could meet that need, because I mean, you've described Plug-in Suffolk, but it's a specific arrangement with EO charging to tackle one issue.
And it's also aimed specifically at commercial premises. It's not aimed at domestic installers. But remember, Ned, we have the Carbon Charter. We have some fine members of the Carbon Charter who EV Driver springs to mind, Greenscape Energy, who can advise people, and you know, people like that.
Perfect. Thank you very much to Peter and to David and to everybody today. I'm going to have to call an end to it there. I think we will just, when this is done, we'll send an email out to all the attendees. I mean, we've had some fairly big topics raised, and I know it can sometimes feel a bit like just talk, and people have said that it's about action, but I do think it is important that we keep these conversations going. There are documents coming out and there's new plans all the time. The technical report for the Suffolk Climate Emergency has been published, which was discussed in the first of these webinars. The County Council has put out its plans for dealing with its the things we'll be looking for on our questionnaire is do people think that this format is useful? And so positive or negative feedback would be very welcome. But also, are there specific topics? You know, is there something that we could focus on, perhaps have a panel discussion around, get people more involved in some of the discussions? Something I would be very keen to see. And then I think the only other thing that I was just going to end on is that, you know, we've heard a lot about how big the challenge is, and it is an enormous challenge, but it's also a challenge that we have to do. I mean, we've set ourselves the target, but climate change is something that demands this of us. So people have talked about the mutual benefits and things, and we do need to look to find those, but also it's just unavoidable. So we need to get to grips with this. I'm very keen that in doing that, we don't make it any harder than it already is. And a lot of that is about drawing on the shared learning. So we have all that network. I mean, we've seen from WOOLLEY, but there's probably 100 companies in the Suffolk Carbon Charter or Norfolk Carbon Charter that we could draw on who would demonstrate excellence and innovation in one way or another. And I think one small thing that we can do from our role in the council is to help get that word out and to stop people having to reinvent the wheel as we try to deal with this enormous challenge around designing a sustainable world that we can continue within. So I'm just going to end on that note as a bit of a plea that if anyone wants to, you know, has a good idea or something that they want us to highlight or get in there and should be influencing the plans that the council or others are putting together, then let myself or Peter or Amy or the team at Groundwork know, and we would always like to hear that. As I say, please keep an eye out for the questionnaire we will be sending out. Otherwise, thank you very much, everybody, for your time. And I hope we will be doing something like this in the future. Thank you.